This is Denise O'Mara. I'm the Director of Education with Equine Land Conservation Resource. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Christine Hughes, the author of Horse-Friendly Zoning Practices in American Communities, is going to be going through the guide with you and letting you know just exactly what's in there and how you can use it. Now, for those of you who don't know what we do at Equine Land Conservation Resource, I'll give you a little bit of a background. Our mission is to help others conserve and protect their horse lands, horse facilities, and trails, and anything related to horse-related activities. Our vision is, as it says here, a future in which horse lands have been conserved so that America's equine heritage lives on, and the emotional, physical, and economic benefits of mankind's bond with the horse remain accessible to all. What we do is revolve our assistance and our educational tools around 6 core issues: planning for horses in your community, conservation tools for horse lands, equine access to public lands, equine access to private lands, the benefits of horses to our communities, and best management practices for land. Now, since we're talking about zoning, we're really focusing on planning for horses in your community this time around. So what we have for you, just to wake you up, is a couple of poll questions, and we'd like you to take a few minutes, read through, and answer to the best of your ability. And here is poll number 1 and number 2.
And for those of you who are answering the poll, you may have to scroll down in the window there to answer all of the questions. And I did add that 3rd question in here as well.
Yes. That one should just take you a moment.
Yep. And the question or the answers are still coming in, so let's give them just another minute to
Alrighty.
submit some responses. Okay, Denise, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Okay. So, how familiar are you with zoning ordinances related to horses and horse keeping in your community or county? It's relatively well spread out amongst the answers, but not very familiar, have seen or heard about equine zoning ordinances, but they have not affected me, is a little bit higher than the others. And what we'd like to do tonight is to explain to you just exactly how equine zoning ordinances can affect you. And then on number 2, where do you keep your horses? Select your primary boarding facility. And of course, you could be boarding in a number of places. Most of you, or a large percentage, are boarding your horses on your own property in a suburban or rural area. In other words, a backyard operation. There are quite a few of you that don't own horses, but you like to see them, or you like to ride when you get a chance. So that is pretty well at opposite poles there. But as you can see, everybody would like to have access to horses, even if they don't board them themselves or own them themselves. And then number 3, 63% of you do know what your horse property is zoned, and 38% don't. And we want to let you know that there are a lot of things involved in zoning that you do need to know. Even those of you who know what your actual zoning is, it can be useful to you to go and review those zoning ordinances that relate to horses in your community. All right. So if you want to know more information about what ELCR does, you can go to our website, and under this particular one, I've got maintenance and stewardship there about trails, so that was the not the one that I was looking for, but there's a lot of useful information in there. If you go to the website and look under the issues pull down and look at planning and zoning for horses in your community, you're going to find a lot of information, including this guide and the guide that Christine wrote in 2015, which was the precursor to this zoning guide. So Christine Hughes is going to be presenting to you. She's a senior planner with the City of Wilmington, North Carolina Planning, Development, and Transportation Department. She oversees their comprehensive planning and design unit, and that's a lot of work. She works extensively with community groups, developing small area, corridor, and comprehensive plans. So she's well versed on the intricacies of the planning process. And she is a member of the American Planning Association and the American Institute of Certified Planners. And so, Christine, I will turn it over to you.
Very good, thank you. Do we have a total head count of how many folks are here tonight?
I believe we have 34 at this time.
34, that's great. I will try to be worthy of your attention, all 34 of you. Sometimes zoning is not the most riveting of subjects, so I appreciate all of you joining us tonight and wanting to learn more, because even though it may not be the sexiest topic, it is actually very important when it comes to keeping horses. Even if you don't own horses, if you want to be able to enjoy horses and ride them occasionally, it's really important, and it has a big impact on what we can and can't do as horsemen and women. So to start with, I just want to talk a little bit about what zoning actually is. This is the legal tool that a local government, and I'm going to use that term local government throughout, and that can be your city, county, your township. It's called different things in different places, but what I mean is that your smallest unit of government, your local government, so it's the tool that your local government uses really to regulate land use, what can and can't be done on a piece of property. Often it also regulates what can and can't be built, where things can be built on the property, and that sort of thing. And all of those rules are codified in the zoning code. We call it a code because it's very hard to understand, and you need to understand the secret language to crack it open sometimes. We use a lot of abbreviations that may not make sense. You can see this zoning map on the slide here. It's just, this is actually the city where I live and work, and if you don't know what those numbers and letters mean, the map doesn't tell you very much. But what it does describe is our zoning districts, and that is the way that a local government really implements the zoning. In most cases, that means separation of uses. So you have your residential uses separate from your industrial uses, and maybe your office and commercial uses somewhere in between. And the zoning map is the second part of the zoning code. So you have the districts and the regulations, the words, the text, and then you have a map that implements the actual code part of it. So it's two parts, the text and the map. Most zoning codes are designed to separate unlike uses, and at a certain level that makes pretty good sense to people. You don't necessarily want a stinky, dirty factory right next door to where you live. So we can all sort of understand it in that context. But it does become a little bit complicated, a little bit hard to understand if it's not something that you deal with on a regular basis. Related to horses and agricultural land uses, we want to think about things like waste, manure storage, water quality, noise, stormwater, odor, fencing. All of those things may pop up in a zoning ordinance. So you may have specific land uses. Yes, you are allowed to use this as a riding facility, but then it may go even deeper into what are those elements that impact how you can use this as a riding facility. So in terms of what makes zoning horse friendly, the guide talks about a few points, 5 points primarily: clear definitions, by right uses, agricultural zoning districts, horse density standards, and flexible setbacks. And I'll touch on each of these points over the next few slides. The definitions are really what gives us a framework, a starting point. And the reason why it's important that a definition is included is because sometimes if something is not included, it may be excluded. So if keeping horses is not defined somehow in the code, does that mean it's excluded? Does that mean that having one horse in your backyard is a commercial operation, or does it mean that that's your pet horse? So without those kinds of definitions in the zoning code, you could run into some complications. It also just helps to make sure that you are on the same page with your planning staff to know what a definition is. I think I know what livestock is, but what does that mean really in a more legal, formal sense? So having those definitions can just help make things move a little smoother. The next point is agricultural districts. These are the districts that are most likely to allow keeping horses, livestock. They're also the most likely to limit development, to limit density and intensity of development. And they're also the most likely to have large lot sizes, which naturally is where we tend to keep large animals. By right uses, special uses, and variances. This is where we start moving into those sort of the secret language of planners, if you will. A by right use is really simple. This is the easiest kind of use, and that just means that as long as you're meeting the rules, it's a use that you're allowed to do. You don't have to get usually you don't have to get any special permits. You don't have to go through any special public hearing or any entitlement process to engage in a by right use. So for example, I live in a neighborhood that is zoned residential 15. By right use in the neighborhood is single family homes. I can go and have my single family home without getting any additional use permits. May have to get a building permit, but I don't have to get any additional use permits. Other things in that district might be special uses or require a variance. So you may be allowed to have a barn and keep a couple of horses, but if you want to engage in riding lessons, teaching lessons, or taking folks out on trail rides and those sort of things, maybe you need a special use permit. In that case, there is an entitlement process, and you may have to go for a public hearing in front of your planning commission, in front of a city council, or that sort of thing. And then the third use type that we want to think about is a variance. Sometimes that requires a public hearing in front of maybe your zoning board of appeals. It may be a staff issued variance, but there's just that extra layer that sits on top of a by right use if you need a variance. And I did get a comment here, please do not use the word pet in conjunction with horses. Animal rights people don't like that word to regulate our horses. In New Jersey, horses are livestock and by law are regulated by the Department of Agriculture. And this is a great point, and this is exactly what I'm talking about in terms of definitions. In some zoning codes, there's a definition of livestock, and it very clearly includes horses. And this is going to vary by not only by state, but by city, county, etc. Each local government may have a different definition. Where the city that I live and work, a horse can be a pet. So it's important that there's a definition there that explains what that is. So because it's a pet, that means if I have a minimum of 3 acres, I can have that pet in my backyard. So that's a really great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Continuing on with what makes zoning horse friendly is the concept of agricultural zoning districts. Usually in an agricultural zoning district, you're going to have large minimum lot areas. Sometimes a large lot, so it can be relative. Sometimes a large lot is 5 acres. In some cases, a large lot is 40 acres. So you have kind of a wide range there of what constitutes a large lot. But having that minimum lot area and that large lot concentration gives us a mass of agricultural land together. And it's sort of that strength in numbers concept. So you have a lot of open land concentrated in one place. And typically these agricultural zoning districts will also have limited non-agricultural uses. It is possible that you have an agricultural district that allows only agricultural uses, but it's more common that you will see agricultural districts that allow limited non-agricultural uses. So for example, it may allow farms and stables and livestock feedlots, that sort of thing, but also churches, potentially schools, things that may be not agricultural in nature, but are deemed to be compatible with agricultural uses. And this is really important to think about where conflicts arise. And in this picture, it's a great example of kind of that conflict zone. You see a farm, but you also see a neighborhood right there. And that's where the conflicts arise. And so if you have limited non-agricultural uses, you can help really minimize the land use conflicts that may pop up. Horse density. You may be familiar with the concept of density in other senses, but it's the same concept. The number of horses per acre is often a measure that is used. The most horse-friendly zoning ordinances will not have a horse density standard, or they will have a flexible horse density standard. And that's really important. If you have a straight horse to land area ratio, it may not account for things that make land more or less suitable for keeping horses. But it is just, at the bottom line, it's a limit on the number of horses that you can keep on property. So if you have a lot of flexibility, perhaps you have, you can account for natural slopes, ponds, etc., things like that, you can count that acreage towards keeping your horses, but you realize that obviously you're not going to keep your horses inside of a pond. So you have some flexibility in how you calculate that number. And as I said, the most desirable standards really are designed to protect animal welfare and also to protect the natural environment more so than just having a strict X number of horses per acre standard. You may find that there are setbacks from streams and creeks and steep slopes and that sort of thing. So that's really intended more to protect the environment and protect the animals than it is to just have a flat out density cap. Setbacks is another factor that we want to think about in horse-friendly zoning. And a setback just simply means where in relation to property lines and buildings things may go. So obviously flexibility in this concept is helpful. You want to set back a safe distance for your animal's sake from streams, wetlands, and natural features. But a zoning code may require a minimum setback. So it may say something like every barn has to be set back 50 feet from a front property line, or every manure storage facility has to be set back 100 feet from a stream bed, or anything kind of like that with a natural feature. So you have setbacks in terms of where your buildings and your structures can go. You may also have setbacks in terms of where your fencing can go. You may have setbacks in terms of where grazing areas may be. So you want to think about the maximum flexibility for your property and for your animals. So if you have a stream that runs through your property and you have a 100-foot setback off of that stream on either side of the bank, then suddenly you have 200 feet plus the width of the stream where you can't have anything potentially. So you want maximum flexibility, but also we want to be thinking about protecting water quality and animal welfare as well. So I'm just going to move into some example or some state level regulations, and every state is different. Of course, I have to offer that caveat. I'm not an expert in any state. I live and work in North Carolina, so that's the state with which I am most familiar. But certainly every state maintains their own regulations. And what states allow and don't allow affects what local governments can and can't do. I wanted to touch briefly on the Right to Farm Act. This is active in all 50 states, and it's really intended to protect farmers and agricultural operators from nuisance lawsuits. And this is really important in states with high growth pressures. So maybe not so much in the center of the country, you may not feel as much growth pressure, but on the coasts for sure, where our populations are exploding, as non-agricultural uses move into rural areas, there is some tension. I worked for a local government in Georgia for a while where every subdivision plat had sort of a disclaimer recorded on it that says you're moving into an agricultural area, and it may include sounds, sights, and smells typical to agricultural uses. So just that awareness of the potential for conflict. So this really just protects operators from nuisance lawsuits. State level regulations often can and do trump any local zoning codes. For example, in North Carolina, cities have a lot of authority in terms of regulating agricultural uses through the zoning code, whereas counties have very little authority, and this is a directive of the state. So in states where the local governments are what we call creatures of the state, where they only have those authorities designated to them by the state, you're going to find this kind of thing a lot. In other states where you have more home rule, where the city or a county or local government can have a little bit more control over how they regulate things, you may not find this quite as much. Sometimes certain uses may be exempt from certain parts of codes. For example, in Michigan building code, there's certain agricultural buildings may be exempt from the building code. In Ohio, agricultural uses may be completely exempt from zoning authority altogether. So it just depends on what state you're in and how your state system is set up to interact with local government. So it can become a complicated issue because you're dealing with multiple layers there, but it's important to check on what's happening where you live and where your horses are. The urban-rural connection is an issue that is near and dear to my heart because I work in an urban area, and we are rapidly losing our rural environment. So I personally am trying very hard to affect a change in that sense. And all I'm really talking about here is that what happens in cities directly impacts rural land. The greatest conflicts really are at the fringes. People who live in cities need open space. We need agricultural land. We need farmers. We need animals. We need fresh air. We need all of these things. And those folks who live in rural areas, farmers, agricultural operators, need cities, need trade, need transportation networks, need all of these things. So we need each other. We can benefit each other, and we can help each other be better. Urban service boundaries and agricultural policies can work closely together, especially if your region is planning on a regional level. Sometimes a regional level might mean 2 or 3 or 4 counties planning together. Sometimes it means 2 or 3 states planning together. It just depends on the context. But we see tools like urban services boundaries and growth management policies that can really help cities and rural areas work together for the mutual benefit of everyone. And an urban service boundary is, it's a remarkably simple concept. Basically just means you draw a line on the map and you say inside of this line is where we're going to concentrate our urban services. So water and sewer connections, the bus system, perhaps, unfortunately, it may also mean your schools, but those core urban services are really going to be concentrated here, and we're going to concentrate all of our population growth, or most of our population growth, inside of this service area. Outside of the service area, we're going to work very hard to maintain that as rural. So it's a simple concept. It can work really well. A lot of cities do it. I would say most cities don't, or else they do it in name only, because it is much easier to develop on open land than it is to redevelop and densify inside of a more urban area. And when we talk about growth management policies, that ties right into that. Perhaps your local government might give a break to folks who are redeveloping and building inside of an urban area in exchange for saving green space or open space somewhere else. So there are things that a local government can do to incentivize that. A lot of developers, and I say this as being sort of an insider in the development world, if you will, you know, they have a bottom line to look out for, and so they're looking for what's quickest, cheapest, and easiest rather than what's necessarily best for the environment or best for the, you know, the overall big picture. So it does help if you have specific growth management policies in place. The other thing that it's really important to think about, and it's hard to prioritize sometimes, is infrastructure costs. And the main driver of this really in terms of consumption of rural land is roadway construction. And if any of you have studied or were around and remember the beginnings of the interstate highway system, that was a huge driver for sprawling development patterns. And it's a very expensive undertaking for the federal government, for state governments, and maintaining roadways is very expensive for local governments. So if you can really structure your infrastructure spending in ways that prioritize open space preservation, you can do a lot of good in terms of keeping population centers sort of in that urban area and maintaining open space outside of that urban area. Infrastructure costs also, you want to think about water and sewer and just raw land consumption. What is the cost, the environmental cost of losing trees, of losing farmland, of losing cropland? What does that really mean? So whereas developers may be thinking about their bottom line, cities, counties, states need to be thinking more about a triple bottom line in terms of how we make those infrastructure spending decisions. Now I'm just going to move right into some examples. And this little guide could be me trying to understand zoning codes because they're about that big, and they take a lot of patience. But as I was researching for the guide, I did come across some really fantastic examples of really horse-friendly zoning. And I saw 63% of you know how your property is zoned for horses, and I think that is awesome. The 38% of you who don't know, I strongly encourage you to call your planning office in the morning and find out what your property is zoned, because as we start talking about these examples, you may find that there are issues that you really like, and you want to know how you can do this in your community, or you may stop and pause and think, oh gosh, that could really be a problem. What am I potentially dealing with? So those 38% of you who don't know, make a note to yourselves to call your planning office in the morning and find out. Has anyone who's listening worked personally, had any personal experience with the Wellington Equestrian Overlay District? If you have, just pop in, let me know in the questions there. I'd like to know if anybody's worked with it personally, but this is an overlay district. And all that means is that it sits like a layer right on top of the base zoning. So you have your base zoning that again talks about uses, setbacks, et cetera, and then you have this layer that sits right over top of it that just adds some additional regulations and additional considerations above and beyond that base zoning. And this overlay is intended to meet these goals to protect equestrian areas, and it grew out of their comprehensive plan, which is what the first guide that I worked on talks about a lot about comprehensive planning. So within this overlay district, there are sub areas that have varying density and minimum lot regulations. They allow equestrian and other supportive uses, and require pedestrian and equestrian circulation plans, which is pretty exciting because that means it's just connecting neighborhoods. It's connecting neighborhoods to each other, neighborhoods to parks, neighborhoods to shopping areas. So you can just hop on, take your horse for a little walk and get to, go run into the store and get what you need, hop back on your horse. And this really helps to make this a horse-friendly area. Where some cities may require sidewalks, pretty cool to think that Wellington is requiring equestrian circulation. Other equestrian amenities are required, like horse parking. I mean, you can't hop on your horse and go to the store if you have nowhere to park your horse when you get there. Bridle path easements, and then there's an additional overlay called Palm Beach Little Ranches that is sort of a scaled back version. I think this is a fantastic example of horse-friendly zoning, but I would offer the caveat that it probably makes land values out of reach for definitely for me. I won't judge what anyone else can do, but it definitely puts them out of reach for me. Moving on then to Lexington, Kentucky. They have 4 agricultural districts. 3 of them are intended to preserve agricultural land, and 1 is intended to transition. And I think that intention to transition is so important because, again, I've said it already a couple of times, the fringes is where the conflict is found. And so if you have that district that's sort of the in-between, what happens in between urban, suburban, and rural areas, you can have that transition where uses are designed to work in harmony, you can really avoid a lot of those conflicts. Large minimum lot areas, some of them up to 40 acres, and they do include specific definitions for agricultural and equine uses. They have very clear purpose statements, so if you find out that you're zoned one of these districts, you can figure out, okay, what does that even mean? What is the intention there? There are 2 overlay zones to provide alternatives to the traditional base zoning, and again, to help minimize those conflicts. And Lexington has the oldest urban growth boundary in the United States. It's been around for a very long time, and it's working quite successfully there. Moving on then to Aiken, South Carolina. This is a really easy to use and understand code. If you just get the itch to start researching zoning, you might enjoy looking at this code. They have 2 horse-centered districts. They allow single-family homes on large lots, and you can keep horses and stables for personal use in these districts. They have a really well-defined use table. In fact, horses get their own, or equestrian uses get their own use table, which makes it really easy to understand. Their horse density standards are pretty flexible, and they're based around water quality, stormwater, manure, and grain storage rather than just strict numbers. It's also interesting to note that they have a very specific provision for dealing with complaints and compliance. So they have a plan in place for what to do when those conflicts might arise. NORCO, California. Confession, I've never been there. I've only read about it, but I was really impressed with some of the things that they are doing there. Over half of their zoning districts allow horse-related uses. They have 3 agricultural zones, which allow equestrian uses on large lots, and they have flexible horse density standards. They do have 2 specific horse overlay zones. The PE district requires a 12-foot wide pedestrian equestrian trail, which again, as I mentioned with Wellington, it just those are the connections that connect developments to each other. And then the other overlay zone, AKO, designates certain properties for animal keeping. And they actually have a provision for housing developments to get a residential density bonus in exchange for providing equestrian facilities within that development. So you can have a higher number of units potentially, which again, that helps the developer's bottom line to have more units in exchange for providing some equestrian facilities. Now I'm going to move into some regional examples. And it's interesting to me as you move across the country how prescriptive or not prescriptive some of these can become. And I'm just going to hit on most of these pretty quickly. Greenwich, Connecticut, and the way these slides are organized on the left column are what makes it horse friendly, and on the right side is what could be a challenge in using the code for horses. You can have up to 6 horses by right in single family zones. More than 6 horses you can still do, but you have to get a special exception. So that's, again, that extra layer, that entitlement process. And the conservation zones do have large minimum lot areas. They have a very lengthy and prescriptive site plan approval process for new development, and it does require a public hearing. So that will add time and money, and probably some frustration too to the whole process of getting that plan approved. You can't, it's not by right. You have to go through that whole entitlement process. Bass River Township in New Jersey, you can have up to 20 horses as a home occupation with site plan approval. Again, you can have more than 20 horses, but it would be permitted as a commercial use, and they have pretty strong definitions in this code. On the challenging side, they have a very strict horse density limit, 1 acre for the first 2 horses, and then you have to have more land for each additional horse. And surface waters, wetlands, and unusable land cannot be counted towards those acreage calculations. So that just means if you have 10 acres and 5 of them are excluded because of being unusable for whatever reason, you can't count that in your density calculation. Moving into the southeast, Currituck County, this is home of the Kerala wild horses. Horses, donkeys, and mules are defined as livestock. Equestrian facilities are permitted in several of the districts by right, and then with a master plan in their PD district. And animal husbandry is allowed by right in 3 districts. On the more of a challenge side, they do have a very strict density standard. They have very strict setbacks for barns, pens, and enclosures, and a horse boarding facility does require additional permits. Loudoun County, Virginia is just outside of Washington, D.C. It's part of the D.C., Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia metropolitan statistical area. So I was really impressed with their code in terms of how much development pressure there is going on in this area. They have 17 non-suburban zoning districts that support rural uses. One may argue they have too many zoning districts to start with, but I was pleased to see that so many of them allow rural uses. They have extensive definitions. They have 4 distinct agricultural districts that support equestrian uses, and agricultural uses and stables are permitted by right in at least 1 district. So again, that means by right, they don't have to go through any public hearing process to do that. Livestock on more than 5 acres requires a farm conservation plan. Equestrian events and stables do require a minimum lot area of 25 acres. There is a cap on the size of some structures that are used for agricultural support. And some uses do require a special exception based on road frontage classification. So if you're on a certain kind of road, a highway versus maybe a local street, you may have to go through that public hearing process to be able to engage in that use. Prince George's County, Virginia is a little bit more of a rural area than Loudoun County. This is south of Petersburg, south of Richmond. Horses are permitted for personal use by right in the single family districts and the agricultural district. So I do talk a lot in these slides about single family districts because in a lot of local governments, the single family districts dominate the zoning map. If you can think back to that zoning map of the city where I work, about 80% of it is single family. Not every place is that heavily loaded with single family, but it does dominate a lot of the zoning map in a lot of places. So it's important to think about what we can do in those districts. They do have strong definitions. A lot of this county is actually designated for farmland preservation, which is a little bit special in my view, and the contiguous open and agricultural land really helps minimize nuisances. So as you move geographically closer to the city center, you have more intense uses permitted, and as you move away from that urbanized area, the land is zoned to help maximize agricultural uses and minimize nuisances. On the challenging side, they do have a pretty strict limit on the density, the horse density, and they do have strict setbacks for fencing, stables, and shelters. Moving into the Midwest region, Highland Charter Township, Michigan, the agricultural and single-family districts are designed to concentrate growth into a central area, which again keeps your rural edges, which again helps minimize conflict, and that's really important. Farming, equestrian, and large animal husbandry uses are permitted in one of their districts, and they also have a district that includes equestrian, that requires equestrian pathways. On the challenging side, the keeping of horses is only permitted in one district, and any training, riding, driving, or stabling for compensation is a special use. So again, that's that entitlement process where you have to potentially go through the public hearing process. St. Louis County, Missouri, has a non-urban district that protects land with rough natural topography and protects non-urban development. So it allows farming by right, feed and grain storage, blacksmithing, riding stables with a conditional use permit. And that conditional use permit is an entitlement process, so it does require a public hearing. 2 districts allow farming by right and riding stables with that conditional use permit. The keeping of horses for personal use is not specifically defined, so that could be potentially a challenge. Only one single-family district allows the keeping of horses, and riding stables are defined as a commercial use. So what I may think of as a non-commercial use may actually be requiring some special permits there. In the Southwest region, moving into Maricopa County, Arizona, this is the Scottsdale, Phoenix, Chandler area. They have very strong definitions in this code. They have rural districts intended to conserve and protect farmlands. These districts allow farms, corrals, and public equestrian uses as an accessory to single-family uses. Public equestrian uses that can't meet the by right standards may be permitted with a special use permit. So this is a pretty ideal situation for horse zoning. They spell out what the standards are, and if you meet them, it's a by right use. If you can't meet them, they're not saying no, they're saying maybe. So that's a really important factor there. And horses are permitted in their single-family districts. On the challenging side, in single-family districts, corrals have a strict setback, and they haven't defined all of their terms. So they've used some of the terms inconsistently, and some of them are not defined at all. Actually, inside of the city of Phoenix, I was a little bit surprised myself to see how horse-friendly their code appears to be. They have several districts that allow agricultural uses. They have a district that allows stables, boarding, and instruction on at least 10 acres. They have a resort district that allows riding stables on at least 10 acres, and they allow horses for personal use in single-family districts and a few of their overlay districts. Like the county that Phoenix is in, their code doesn't specifically define a lot of the terms they use, and they use these terms inconsistently. And they have pretty strict setbacks for equestrian facilities. In the Northwest, Jefferson County, Colorado, they allow horses, again, in more than half of their districts. The county maintains an at-a-glance guide for keeping horses, which is really great. If you don't want to dive into the entire zoning code, you can just open this document and get a really good feel for what the regulations are, and also how to get more information if you need it. And they have multiple districts that have that large minimum lot area. And this area is just outside of Denver, so it may be not surprising that they have some horse-friendly regulations here. They do have strict horse density standards, and they have additional fencing requirements for keeping stallions, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. If anyone's ever dealt with stallions, you may impose those regulations on yourself anyway. Spokane County, Washington, I'm sorry. This is right on the Montana-Washington state line, and it is where Spokane, the city, is. They have 5 zones for agricultural preservation. Animal raising and keeping is permitted in 3 zones. Can you describe the meaning of fence in states? I'm going to hit on that in just a second, if I can save that for later, the question that just popped up. Resource lands have a large minimum lot area. They have 5 rural zones, 4 with large lot sizes, and single-family zones allow the keeping of horses or animals, and low-density plus district allows animal keeping with conditions. So they've got a lot of flexibility in which districts allow keeping animals and horses. They do have a strict horse density limit, strict setback requirements, and animal raising is a permitted use, but it's not defined. So that could be a challenge when you walk in and say, I'm going to raise my fill in the blank kind of animal, and they haven't defined to which animals that applies. And in the West region, Marin County, not Colorado, but California, there's a typo there. This is the county just north of San Francisco. They allow up to 5 horses for personal use in most of the residential districts. They have several agricultural districts, all of which allow equestrian facilities. Equestrian access easements in new developments, and I do see a question in the box about easement, so I will come back to talk about that in just a moment. And their coastal zone requires a conditional use permit for keeping horses, and this is really an environmental consideration. So again, they're not saying no, they're just saying with some extra steps, you can probably keep horses here. On the challenge side, the regulations are split between 2 separate ordinances. They have a zoning ordinance and they have a development ordinance. Now, a lot of local governments have moved to make these just one ordinance, so everything is in one place, but not in Marin County. It's still 2 separate ordinances, so you may have to flip back and forth to see everything that applies to your property. Strict horse density limits. Horse keeping does require special approval. It's not a by right use. Their definitions are somewhat unclear. They do prohibit stables and pastures in some environmentally constrained areas, and they do limit building materials and outdoor lighting. And then Woodside, California, they have extensive definitions. They have a special conservation district to protect rural areas, 5 open space districts, animal keeping and private stables and rural conservation and single family districts is a by right use. And open covered arenas, commercial stables are permitted as a conditional use in the open space districts. They do have, again on the challenge side, separate regulations for stables in the business regulations chapter of their code. So you have to know to look at a whole separate chapter of the city code to figure out what those additional regulations are. They do have a license requirement for keeping horses. Private stables require an annual permit. They have very strict horse density limits. They have a prohibition on stables and pastures where there are steep slopes. Again, this is an environmental concern. And again, limits on building materials and outdoor lighting. So they are treating in this code, keeping horses a little bit more like a business. So you would want to be on the lookout for what other regulations would be applicable to you there. So to connect it all together, check with your local zoning code, your planning department, and your building department. I promise you that planners are people too. It would be my wish for all of you to find a planner who is also an equestrian, so that they can empathize and relate and help you understand the whole process. But we're all just people too. So give us a call your local office and find out what your property is zoned. Take a look at your comprehensive and your long range plans. This is sort of the starting point for a lot of work that local governments do in zoning. So the comprehensive plan and the long range plan are your opportunity to step back, think about the big picture, decide what you want as a community, and then you build the regulations that support those goals. So take a look at what those plans are. understand what your state regulations are. Do they trump your zoning code? Do they give you some extra wiggle room? Do they make things a little more challenging for you? It's just important to know. Pay attention to changes in your zoning code and in your zoning. So that's the text and the map itself. So pay attention to when things change. This may come to your attention in the form of a sign posted on a property, and it's going to come with all kinds of code and gobbledygook and letters that don't add up. You might see a sign that says rezoning or SUP or CUP or BOA or some combination of letters and numbers that you just stop and go, I don't even know what that means. Call your zoning office and find out what it means. Pay attention to the changes. And then just remember that what happens in cities matters for rural areas, and what happens in rural areas matters for cities. It's so easy to lose sight of that sometimes because we just get so wrapped up in what's happening right in front of us. So I'm going to jump in on these questions and keep them coming if you've got additional questions. Howard asks, how do prescriptive easements relate to zoning? So easements kind of sit on top of zoning in a way. It's an easier way to think about it. So an easement is usually held by a second person. So I own a piece of property and I give my neighbor an easement to share my driveway because they don't have a driveway on their property. So I give up, I'm actually giving up a piece of my property right to my neighbor for some purpose, in this case to use the driveway. And that person now, through the easement, has legal access to that part of my property which I have given him. And easements can be donated or given or purchased for all sorts of things. The equestrian trails easement that we talked about in Wellington, in that case, you may have a property that you're building out, and as a condition of that development approval, you give the city an easement. So it becomes a public access easement. And we see this all the time with sidewalks or bike trails or bridle paths, whatever it may be. I own the land. I give the city the easement. The city then has that kind of ownership stake in that piece of the property that I've given them the easement for, and they allow the public to use it. So in terms of zoning, that's most likely what you're going to see. You're getting public access to private land through that easement option. Can you describe the meaning of fence-in states? So I do touch on in the guide, I believe it's Nevada, and I want to say that with some certainty, that does not require animals to be fenced in, so they're free to roam. In this day and age, most states are fence-in states, simply for the fact that we are rapidly developing, our population is growing, and so you're required actually to contain your animals on your property. You can't herd them across the plains so much anymore like you used to be able to do. Thank you for doing this webinar. You are very welcome, Judy. I hope that it does help you understand zoning terms and regulations. And the secret to understanding zoning terms and regulations is just to look up the code. A lot of local governments these days post those codes online, so you can actually dig through them on your own time and help yourself better understand them if you don't have time to pop into the zoning office. Mary says, to keep an eye on zoning changes, we have Neighborhood Bill of Rights. You define your neighborhood as small or as large as you want, and you will get information on any changes in that area. Very helpful. This is a fantastic idea, and this is one of the things that I absolutely advocate for interest groups doing. It's a great way to help you keep in touch with what's going on and really lobby for your own needs and your own interests. So I think that that's a fantastic thing. What role can a land trust have? That's a big question. They can have a huge role. I live in a coastal area. So we have a coastal land trust, and the land trust actually purchases land to have and to hold. And that just means that they own it and they don't develop it, and they protect it because that's what they believe in. And so you can have a land trust that fills many different roles, mostly land acquisition. Sometimes they'll hold easements. Sometimes they'll hold first right of refusal. So they'll say, okay, so-and-so can buy the land, but if they ever sell it, then we get first right to buy it back. So that's a great tool for land preservation, open space preservation. Kathleen asked, can we get a copy of your PowerPoint? Absolutely. I'm sure Denise will let you all know how to get that.
Yes, that the entire presentation is recorded, and it will be available on the ELCR website and on the My Horse University website.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Debbie asks, are easements usually granted using allowance for building on a smaller lot? And if I think I understand your question, correct me if I'm wrong, Debbie, but can you get an easement for maybe access to a parcel or some kind of shared access to a parcel when the lot is small? And the answer is probably so. An easement can be a transaction between private parties, and it's recorded with your deed, and you can give an easement for a lot of different things. The driveway example I gave earlier was a true story from my life. I lived in a downtown area where we had very, very small lots. They were 33 feet wide, and there wasn't room for two driveways. So two neighbors went in together, put in one driveway that they shared, and they each had an easement for that driveway. So it's a great tool for things like that on small lots, for sure.
Debbie, let me know if that answered your question. If you have another take on that, just contact me at the ELCR info section, or you can email me directly, and that's DOMEARA, DOMEARA, at elcr.org. And if anybody has any questions that we didn't answer here tonight, or that, that as you look at this again, you come up with, we'll be glad to answer those questions for you. Now, there are a couple of questions, or a question and comment in the webinar chat room. Christine, I don't know if you have access to that or you can see that. If not, I can go ahead and read them off.
Sure, I can't see them.
Oh, okay. Margaret Papp, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I don't have my glasses on right at the moment. She says, what do you recommend for broadening the inclusion of horse trails as recreation, like bike, at the local level? Do you want to take that, or shall I answer that?
Well, both. I mean, I think that you can write it into the code so that it's required if it's a community priority, and that goes back a little bit to the comprehensive plan idea. Did your community identify multiple modes of transportation as a priority? Did they identify recreation as a priority? Did they identify equestrian uses as a priority? Any of those things will give you something to stand on to look at making a code change to require trail easements.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the way to kind of bring that agenda to the attention of the decision makers in your community is to approach them from the standpoint of an organization. If you are a member of a riding club or local horse association, it's very helpful to have the backing of a group of people behind you who are well aware and educated on the zoning requirements and the zoning situation and what's in the comprehensive plan, so that you can make your needs known to them as they're doing planning, as they're rewriting zoning, or to get new zoning with horse-friendly language in it. Mm-hmm. And that kind of goes along with Debbie. Debbie asked another question, Debbie Briscoe, how do you encourage builders to give a trail easement? Who holds the public trail easement? That's a good one. That's something that we do in Lexington, and a lot of communities do that. You can't actually build a subdivision without creating a trail easement. Now in Lexington we have a greenway plan that covers a lot of where that's supposed to go. There's an actual alignment in several areas for greenway trails. The trails don't exist in some of these areas, but as builders build, they have to create the corridor for that, and then they usually have to do you know, an alignment for the trail, and they may go ahead and do a hard surface, or they might do a soft surface. Kind of depends on what the city is looking for. Who holds the public trail easement? If it's part of the city's greenway plan or the community's greenway plan, then the city would take ownership of that, and it could fall under engineering or parks and recreation, or maybe there's another department in the government that will take hold of that. Now, if you're talking about private trail easements, that's another whole ball game, and we could have another webinar on that. We talk about that quite frequently, actually, and that is a little bit different because you don't have an agency that not only owns the land or can purchase the land that the easement is going to go on. You've got to convince your private landowners that it's a really good thing to have a horse trail or a bike trail or whatever the trail is going to be on their land. They're somewhat protected by the liability laws that are in, I think, 49 of the 50 states now. But there is always the potential for some liability to come up. So it's sometimes can be a hard sell, but if the trail easement or the trail itself has been used for a long period of time and there haven't really been any problems, and you have a good relationship with these landowners, you still have to build that whole system owner by owner by owner. So there's quite a bit that goes into that too.
And you can't have privately owned, publicly accessible trails.
Right.
My personal feeling on it is that it's most efficient when it's held by a public agency. So usually a local government, because of the liability issues, because of the consistency of maintenance, because of the consistency of operation, and you're not likely to get that. Well, I don't like you, I'm going to take my ball and go home kind of attitude from the city that you may potentially get when private ownership changes hands.
Okay, Debbie, did we answer your question now? I hope so. But anyway, you can get a hold of me or anybody in the office here, and we can answer any further questions that you've got about trail easements and developers and whatnot. There is one more comment. Actually, there's a couple. Margaret says, thank you. You're very welcome. And Deborah Stock said, thanks for the presentation. All new info for me and very helpful. Well, thank you very much. I'm really glad that we had a very good turnout for this, and I think it's going to be just great information for you going down the road. Oh, let me see. There is one more question. Penny Pasalacqua. We see our park district transitioning bridle trails to paved trails through an area coordinating agency, even though these have been bridle trails since the park district formed 100 years ago. Yes, that is an issue that has been happening in some communities around the country. You have to understand that there is a very vibrant horse community, well, yes, that too, but bike community, and they have a lot to say, and sometimes they have better access to funding, and they tend to get listened to first, but that's because horse people tend to not walk in the door and make their case until after everybody else has. So, you know, lesson learned on
the bicyclists are a very, very organized community.
Yes.
So we can stand on even ground with them.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, thank you to everyone for listening in. If I missed anything as far as questions or information that you need, just contact us at elcr.org or send me an email or give us a call. And same goes for Christine. And I want to thank My Horse University for their wonderful assistance in helping us to do these webinars. So thank you very much.